He carried a loaded, undeclared gun through a TSA checkpoint. His department voted against him unanimously. His former boss of 40 years is calling for his resignation. And the investigation he oversaw from day one is now being described by insiders as having been derailed by a rushed judgment made in the very first hours, a judgment that treated a kidnapping as a wellness check and cost evidence that can never be recovered. This is not just a story about what went wrong. This is a story about what that means for finding Nancy Guthrie. I am Mekhel. This is the Mekhel Report. If you are new here, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We stay on this case until there are answers. Let us start with the latest revelation about Sheriff Chris Nanos, because it is not a distraction from the Nancy Guthrie investigation. At this point, it is part of the same pattern. According to multiple reports, Nanos allegedly carried a loaded, undeclared firearm through a TSA security checkpoint. This is not a minor procedural lapse. Carrying an undeclared loaded weapon through airport security is a federal matter, the kind of incident that, for any private citizen, would result in immediate detention and potential federal charges. For the sitting sheriff of a major Arizona county, whose department is already under a no-confidence vote from every single deputy in the union, whose former chief deputy of 40 years has publicly called for his resignation, and whose handling of the most high-profile kidnapping case in the country has been described by insiders as a pattern of amateurish missteps. It is another piece of a picture that has been building since the first press conference. This is the context in which the Nancy Guthrie investigation has been operating. A department whose leadership is being pulled in multiple directions simultaneously, whose sheriff is facing a recall effort, a no-confidence vote, resume discrepancy allegations, a board of supervisors inquiry, and now this. Every hour of institutional attention absorbed by these controversies is an hour not focused on finding Nancy Guthrie. Former law enforcement analysts have been consistent on this point. The fish stinks at the head, the investigators doing the actual work, the men and women in the field, the ones processing evidence and knocking on doors and working the contractor lists are not the problem. The structural failure originates at the top. And that structural failure has consequences that extend directly into the evidentiary record of this case. The recall effort continues, the Board of Supervisors engaged. Whether Nanos ultimately remains in office or is removed through a special election, the damage to this investigation's early handling is already done. What cannot be changed is what happened on the morning of February 1st, when a team without the experience to recognize what they were looking at walked through a crime scene that should have been locked down from the first moment of the first deputy's arrival. The rush judgment question, the decision made in the first hours that sources close to the investigation say derailed the entire early trajectory, needs to be examined in its full consequence. Multiple insider accounts confirmed across separate reporting lines describe the same initial posture when investigators arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st. The working theory they operated under was that an elderly woman had wandered off. That theory was not irrational in isolation. Tucson law enforcement deals regularly with elderly residents with cognitive issues who leave their homes and become disoriented. In a jurisdiction where that scenario plays out multiple times a year, pattern recognition can become a trap. You see a missing elderly woman, and your brain reaches for the explanation your experience has made most familiar. But here is what was present at that scene that should have broken that pattern immediately. Blood on the front steps. A Ring camera that had been disabled, not failed, not malfunctioned, but physically interfered with. Back doors propped open. A woman whose daughter was calling hospitals in New York City because she was already saying, from the first phone call, that her mother could not walk to the mailbox, that she did not wander, that this was not that kind of situation. The family was telling them. The blood was telling them. The disabled camera was telling them. The initial response team, led by a supervisor who, according to a source close to the investigation, had never worked a homicide case before, being placed in charge of the homicide unit, stayed with the wandered-off theory. They ran the scene as a search and rescue situation. People moved through areas that should have been treated as a primary forensic evidence zone. The exterior surfaces where the suspect had walked, the front porch, the front walk, the mat at the threshold, were not immediately protected and processed with the urgency that the evidence in front of them demanded. Former law enforcement analysts and retired investigators covering this case have used specific technical language to describe the cost of that decision. Electrostatic shoe impressions that could have been lifted from the surfaces where the suspect walked are gone. The front doormat directly in the path of the figure visible on the Nest camera footage, almost certainly containing blood deposition and trace evidence, was not collected in the initial sweep. The garage, the interior entry area, and multiple surfaces that forensic investigators would have prioritized in a properly secured crime scene may have been degraded before they could be fully documented and collected. None of that is recoverable. The sushi, as a retired FBI agent put it in his analysis of this case, has been sitting out. You cannot put it back. But here is what that same retired FBI agent said about the suspect, and it is one of the most analytically important assessments to emerge from the investigation so far. The figure on the Nest camera footage is calm, not rushing, not panicking, moving through Nancy Guthrie's front entrance with a composure that, in the professional assessment of people who have spent careers studying the behavioral signatures of violent criminals, does not look like a first-time offender acting on impulse. Private investigators and former law enforcement professionals analyzing the publicly available footage have pointed to what they describe as a specialized skill set. The calm is not incidental. It is either the product of prior criminal experience, someone who has committed acts of this seriousness before and has learned to manage the physiological response to high-stakes situations, or it is the result of extensive mental preparation, the kind of preparation that comes from having thought through every step of an operation, having rehearsed it, having visited the location multiple times, having planned for contingencies. Several details support the specialized skill set assessment when you look at the full operational picture. The surveillance operation spanning at least 3 weeks before the abduction, the use of the property's own objects to prop open the gate, demonstrating prior knowledge of the yard layout gained through those visits, the absence of forced entry at any point of the property, the coordination between at least 2 individuals, one inside, one at the front, that the security door evidence requires, the decision to park well away from the house, beyond any camera's sightline, the 40-minute window inside the house, leaving no visible signs of struggle despite the extraction of a physically frail 84-year-old woman from her bed. Each of those decisions, in isolation, could be attributed to luck or improvisation. Together, they describe someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who had thought about counter-surveillance, about evidence minimization, about entry and egress planning. Former investigators have repeatedly revised their early assessments of this suspect. What initially looked like an amateurish operation, the gun visible in the footage, the foliage placed over the camera, rather than simply leaving, has over 60-plus days without an arrest, begun to look more like a mix of inexperience and preparation. Not a professional in the organized crime sense, but not a random opportunist either. Someone in between, with a specific skill set and enough local knowledge to have selected and studied a specific target over a specific period of time. The ransom note dimension of this case has taken a deeply troubling turn, and it deserves to be addressed directly with the honesty that the Guthrie family and the public deserve. Multiple reports have emerged suggesting that Savannah Guthrie received a communication claiming her mother was dead. The specific framing in various outlets describes language indicating Nancy had gone to be with God. This has not been authenticated by law enforcement. Official sources have not confirmed the content or origin of this specific communication, and in a case that has generated dozens of fraudulent ransom attempts and exploitative communications from people with no connection to the crime, the possibility that this is another fabrication is real and must be stated clearly. What can be said carefully with appropriate framing is that the ransom note trajectory of this case has followed an unusual pattern from the beginning. The initial demand came with a delay rather than immediately after the abduction. Communications were routed through media outlets, including TMZ and local television stations, rather than directly to the family. Savannah Guthrie confirmed publicly that she believes 2 of the ransom notes were genuine, that the family responded that she said, "We will pay," but that proof of life was never provided. The absence of proof of life throughout the entire ransom communication period is the detail that forensic criminologists keep returning to. In a genuine kidnapping for ransom, proof of life serves the kidnapper's interest as much as the family's. It confirms that the person being held is alive and that the payment will produce something of value. A kidnapper who has their intended victim alive and wants money has every incentive to provide that confirmation. The absence of it across the entire communication history of this case either means the kidnappers were extraordinarily incompetent at the mechanics of ransom negotiation, or it means the situation they found themselves in prevented them from providing it. Savannah Guthrie, who has access to information the public does not have, has continued to say the investigation is ongoing and her mother could still be alive. She said that on camera recently, with the weight of someone who has been receiving information from investigators and from the family's own legal and investigative team, hold on to that. She has not given up, and she has more information than we do. The specialized skill set assessment connects directly to the question of who this investigation should be focusing on, and there are specific categories of person that investigators have been systematically working through: contractors and subcontractors with prior access to Nancy Guthrie's home, people who had been on the property in the weeks and months before the abduction, who knew the layout, who knew the access points, who had seen the back door's condition, who may have noted whether it was typically locked or occasionally left open. Individuals identified through cell tower dumps as having been present in the neighborhood across multiple dates, not just February 1st, but the surveillance dates in January and potentially the December dates when Google searches for the Guthrie property address were occurring in Arizona. Anyone connected to the vehicle surveillance leads, the white van and the gray or silver SUV or pickup truck that investigators have been tracking through footage from nearby commercial location, including a Culver's restaurant and a Circle K gas station within 2 miles of the property. And here is a thread that has not received enough attention: the question of who removed the Nest camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door. Multiple reports have indicated that investigators believe they know or are close to knowing who removed and disabled that camera. They have not said why publicly, but if investigators have identified the person who disabled the camera, that is not a peripheral detail. That is potentially one of the most significant investigative developments in this case. The Nest camera was not simply knocked askew. It was interfered with deliberately in a way that required physical interaction with the device. That interaction left potential trace evidence. It was captured in part by the same camera before it was disabled. And if investigators have developed intelligence about who that figure is, even without yet having enough for an arrest, that represents a thread that, if pulled correctly, leads somewhere. Let us talk about what the investigation actually looks like at day 62. Because the gap between what people expect to see and what investigations of this complexity actually look like is one of the main reasons public frustration builds in cases like this one. Retired FBI Special Agent Jason Gishin, who spent 20 years in digital forensics and cryptocurrency investigations, described this in terms that are worth understanding. Cases like this do not break through dramatic realizations. They break through chains of small digital connections that are built one subpoena at a time. Each warrant requires probable cause. Each subpoena takes time to be served and returned. Each record returned opens new questions that require additional warrants. The cell tower data from January 11th, January 24th, and February 1st. The Google search records from December. The Nest camera cloud data that Google's technical teams are reportedly still working to fully recover. The Bitcoin wallet address being watched by the FBI's virtual asset unit. The contractor work orders and the interviews. The DNA laboratory work. All of these threads are moving simultaneously. None of them in this kind of investigation moves at the speed people conditioned by television dramas expect. The legal architecture of American law enforcement requires probable cause for every piece of digital evidence obtained. A single chain of digital evidence in a case like this can require dozens of individually filed and returned warrants before it produces an identification. That is not a failure. That is due process functioning as it is supposed to function. It protects innocent people from being swept up by law enforcement moving too fast on too little evidence. It means that when a case like this does result in an arrest and prosecution, the evidence chain is legally defensible and capable of surviving the most rigorous cross-examination a skilled defense attorney can mount. The cost of that legal rigor is time. The cost of the early scene mishandling is that the time required is longer than it should have been, but the investigation is moving. Multiple experienced analysts who have looked at the totality of what investigators have, the DNA, the digital evidence, the second crime scene that exists wherever Nancy Guthrie was taken, have said the same thing. This case will break. The question is when, not if. Here is where this case stands on day 62, and here is why the person who took Nancy Guthrie should not feel safe. The investigation's early failures are documented, confirmed by insiders, and will likely be litigated in court whenever an arrest is made. A supervisor who had never worked a homicide, a rushed judgment toward a wandered-off theory that cost the first hours of a kidnapping investigation, a crime scene released too quickly, evidence that cannot be recovered. These are real failures with real consequences. But they are not the end of this case. They are the beginning of its complications. Because here is what also exists: DNA that has not expired, a complex mixture being worked by scientists whose methods are advancing specifically because of this case, a Bitcoin address that has never moved, watched, recorded, ready to be traced the moment it does, cell tower data from multiple dates processed one warrant at a time, Google search records from December that connect to accounts, that connect to phones, that connect to cell tower histories, a Nest camera's cloud infrastructure being mined for additional imagery, contractor interview records, vehicle surveillance footage, a specialist forensic genealogist who has said publicly, not as a hope, but as an analytical assessment, that if a viable DNA profile is extracted, this case resolves within weeks, and a suspect who had a specialized skill set, who was calm on camera, who had been there before, who knew the yard well enough to find a flower pot in the dark, who coordinated an operation with at least one other person, who has been managing the weight of this for over 2 months, the first person in that group to decide that the weight is too heavy, that $1 million, or a clear conscience, or the simple exhaustion of carrying this outweighs whatever loyalty or fear has kept them quiet, ends this for everyone involved. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CAL-FBI, anonymous. No arrest required, no conviction required, over $1 million, one phone call. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home, her family deserves to know what happened, and the country that has been watching this case for over 2 months deserves to see the people responsible face the full weight of American justice. We are not done here. We stay until there are answers. If this video gave you something, share it right now. One share might reach the person holding the piece of this that makes the loop close. Like this video. And if the Meckel Report is new to you, this is what we do here. We go deeper. We stay longer. We do not let this go quiet. I am Meckel. This is the Meckel Report. Thank you for watching.